Welcome to type mapping using MTRi, the Managing Team Role Indicator. If you watched the previous video introducing type mapping, you will have understood that it takes a dynamic view of personality. In fact, it addresses a confusion that arises from observing people's range and variety of behaviours, because it recognises that some behaviour is heavily influenced by their circumstances, and some is driven by their inner nature. This is what I call the difference between being and doing. This video describes a good way to explore the doing part of this process. This is what I will cover. Why develop the MTRi in the first place? Because there is a confusion between personality and team role measurement, and MTRi forms part of an approach that creates greater clarity. I'll tell you more about what MTRi really is, because it describes a model that enables the classification of behaviours, allowing people to discuss the roles they choose to play in different groups and different settings. Then, if you're going to introduce MTRi, I will suggest where, when, and how it can be done usefully. And of course, there is how to use the MTRi. I will suggest ways that help individuals and groups and teams to gain insight and to develop. And finally, I will summarize why I use MTRi. In the first video, where I introduced type mapping, I made the case for recognizing a dynamic approach to personality using a tug-of-war metaphor. If one end represents the outside, the pressures due to circumstances, and the other end represents the inside, our inner nature, then in between is the result of that tension, which is our behavior, here represented by the red ribbon. The purpose of the MTRi is to help describe people's behavior, recognizing that we all play several roles in our lives. It allows people to express their adaptability to circumstances, and this is quite unlike traditional questionnaires that mix and confuse preferences and behaviours in an attempt to identify some generalised and stable average. Hence, the MTRi was developed because there is a clear gap in the market. No other measures respect people's flexibility and enables them to describe the degree to which they do that. Furthermore, because it is based on a powerful underlying theory, it is the key that opens the door to a development journey that is quite profound. To achieve its purpose, the MTRi needs a useful way to classify behaviours that focus on getting things done. So imagine you're faced with a task. What is the first thing you must do? You must understand the task. And to understand it, you need to make sure you have sufficient information in sufficient detail so that you are clear. Otherwise, you could be doing the wrong thing or solving the wrong problem. The behaviour involved here I'm going to call clarifying. Now, sometimes when we've clarified the task, we need to understand its depth and its breadth, and that's certainly true in more complex tasks. So I'm going to call this analysing. And too often, when we think we understand, there is a temptation to move into action. So it is worth a pause to consider different possible solutions, to think laterally about different ways the task could be approached. I'm going to call this innovating. And then before choosing one of the possible approaches, we should again pause. Perhaps some solutions are too elaborate, too complicated, too expensive by whatever yardstick. We need to consider the value in terms of return on effort. Is it really worth it? Could we be more expedient? Because this evaluates the value, I'm going to call this campaigning. And once we've decided that something is worth it, is worth doing, we need to ask who's going to be involved and what is the impact that it could have on others. Are the right people on board? Are the people involved able to communicate together, collaborate together? I call this harmonizing. Now, once we know who should be involved, and they are positively engaged, we need a reality check. Will the ideas really work in practice? In engineering and construction, there is usually a testing or a pilot phase. In behavioural terms, I call this exploring. And now we come to the stage where we need to make sure we have a workable plan, a suitable strategy. Are the steps correctly sequenced? Do we have feedback mechanisms to keep us on track? Typically, this is a managerial role, and I will call it conducting. And it is only now that we can really forge ahead with implementation. And I'm going to call this activating. These 8 stages can be described using gerunds, the form of a verb, which means it is doing rather than being. In this way, it is not implying who you are, but rather what you do. And these behaviors double up as a method for managing tasks. Let me explain. By presenting the sequence on the previous slide, there is a danger that it is seen as sequential. However, some tasks are so simple that we can go straight to implementation. Or we realize that we need to engage the right people before we begin. But too often, stages are missed out and people don't realize it, usually because it's not part of their underlying preferences. More on that later. And frequently, people tend to do things the way they have always done them. It can be a useful discipline to check in on some of the steps, such as here, innovating. Could we do this in a better way? Now, MTRi is part of the type mapping system, which means that it feeds into a map of behaviors and preferences, which you will see here represented by the wheel. And the behaviors I've just described suggest that we start here and we go round the inner circle, the more thoughtful and perhaps introverted style of behaviors, and then go round the outer circle, the more externally focused behaviors that convert ideas into reality. And to give you the fuller picture, the wheel is also the way in which we map personal preferences, shown here with the letter codes that people have become familiar with through the MBTI, or Myers-Briggs, but which are based on a substantial underlying theory developed by Carl Jung. To understand this preference model for understanding personality, there is another video which describes and explains the TDI, the type dynamics indicator, which is the one in the type mapping system that looks at the personality, the inside of a person's makeup. It can be very useful to introduce the tug-of-war metaphor to people that you want to complete the MTRi. It helps them to acknowledge their own potential flexibility in terms of their behavior, and it helps them to separate personality from their role. I explain that they need to keep the situation, the context, the outside in mind, and answer with what they think they do, their behavior, their main contribution in that situation with those people in that team. That's what the MTRi is focusing on. If you want to introduce MTRi with the fuller type mapping picture, because you may go on to explore personality and how that is involved, then I would describe the 4 selves model. The story goes like this. Imagine this is you. Part of you is public, but part of you is inside, more private. And now imagine the head of the mafia walks in. How would you behave? Or perhaps 2 very different personalities enter the room. Or this little girl suddenly bursts in. Each one of these elicits different kinds of behavior, and I call this the contextual self. Clearly, where I am influences what I do. I make the point that we can all play several roles. There are many contextual selves. However, behind every role, there is always a sense of who I really am. Good actors, and we are all actors to some degree, they can play many roles on stage. They almost become the role. But I guess that Laurence Olivier never identified so closely that he really believed he was Hamlet or Henry V. Hence, behind every role we play, there is always a sense of who I really am, which I call the identity self. But let's not stop there. Whatever your sense of identity, all of us have some image of the person we would like to be, which I call the ideal self. And few people live up to this image of their ideal self. One version of the TDI is designed to help people express their identity self, but there is another version which identifies the difference between a person's sense of identity and their ideal self. And understanding this difference is an important step on the road to maturity. And finally, as people develop greater self-awareness, they realize that there is always more to discover. We all have hidden depths, and we can all still surprise ourselves. Imagine suddenly being in a war zone or a refugee camp. How would you react? What new things would you discover about your resilience, your bravery, your generosity, etc.? Hence, there is always an undiscovered self. Presenting these ideas before people complete any of the questionnaires can really help people understand how they are in a process of discovery, and it helps them to separate their identity from their behavior and to answer the questionnaires more accurately. The third way I use to introduce the MTRi is to help them to understand the model using experiential exercises. For example, the Smarties exercise. It begins with getting them to open the Smartie box that I give them, and then we go through various exercises which make each of the 8 roles tangible, or at least more understandable. If you intend to use the MTRi, you're welcome to get in touch to get more details. Once a person has completed the MTRi, they receive a 20-page Explorer report. This details the roles they believe they play, and the top roles are described with useful graphical summaries. And in addition, if they've also completed the ITPQ, they receive a report which details the roles that they believe they should or that the team should focus on to manage the challenges they face. Together, these 2 questionnaires answer simple but profound questions. The first is, what am I doing or contributing in this situation, group or team? Something that people find very hard to articulate, which is why the MTRi is so useful. But the ITPQ answers the question, what should I or my team be doing or contributing more of if I want to improve? Hence, these 2 questionnaires provide a useful picture of the current situation, but with the additional element of suggesting the direction of travel. This makes it a very poignant and practical tool for stimulating change. If you've watched the previous video, the introduction to type mapping, you may remember the criticism that personality questionnaires often mix behavior with attitudes and preferences, and some even demand that you have a context in mind, such as at work, proposing a kind of work personality. This is because the issue of context has not been clearly addressed. Such questionnaires are really asking you about your role, and of course, your role can be influenced by your personality, but it is not the same thing. You then have role questionnaires that invite you to generalize across contexts, which begins to infer some underlying personality, perhaps a team personality. Now, type mapping makes things very clear. If you are interested in roles, then people must have a specific context in mind. This explicitly acknowledges that people can play different roles, that people do have flexibility, and the MTRi, therefore, is a clear role questionnaire. If you're interested in personality, the TDI is the one that you use to explore preferences. But then type mapping adds the further dimension neglected by all the other approaches. It analyzes the demands of the situation using the ITPQ, the Ideal Task Profile Questionnaire. Now this video is focusing on the MTRi and the ITPQ, but introducing them can be understood by asking three key questions. First of all, here, what are you doing? And then, here, you're saying, what should you be doing? And then the question arises, why aren't you doing what you should be doing? Which is often because of the way our inner nature makes us view the world through our own sometimes distorted lens that suits our personality. The type mapping system comes with display software which enables you to view results for either individuals or groups. And here you can see the results for 5 people with a clear blue and green focus. This is the picture of a results-driven team. But here you see their ITPQ results, which are quite diverse. The MTRi had identified potential gaps in the roles currently being played, which once clarified and made more conscious, most teams have a better chance of managing. However, the ITPQ highlighted a significant issue. Each person had a different idea about what they should be doing more of. And this disagreement is usually a recipe for either conflict or chaos. And so achieving a clearer understanding and consensus is an essential step towards building more effective collaboration. This illustrates the importance of understanding situational challenges and reinforces the value of having a tool that links situational demands to current activity. In summary, by mapping what people are currently doing with the MTRi and having a clearer picture of what they should be doing with the ITPQ, this is what makes the type mapping approach such a worthwhile and practical tool for becoming more effective. Once they had discussed their ITPQ results and reached greater consensus regarding the behaviours they would need to nurture, they wanted to explore how their roles fitted their preferences, to better understand how their nature may help or hinder the changes they wanted to manage. They then completed the TDI, and here we see great divergences. There is a clear red and yellow preference. In this team, they were desperate to fit the organisation's drive culture, and so they were playing roles that appeared to be what was needed, but they were not doing this as effectively as they might. And the mismatch with their preferences highlights that their roles may be a stretch and therefore need more support, or potentially a source of stress and dissatisfaction. But further discussion of the TDI is a topic for the next video. At the beginning, I said I would summarize why I like the type mapping system. And my first point is that it is simple but not simplistic. This makes it easy to use, and since the questionnaires can be used independently, it can be introduced in bite-sized chunks. My second point is that whichever questionnaire you start with, they deliver immediate value to the taker due to the accessibility and usefulness of the reports. My third point is that the 3 lenses provide 3 possible entry points to suit many different people, teams or situations. It also covers ground that no others do by mapping what's going on inside, how people are responding, behaving, and then adding the much neglected area, the mapping of its situational demands. My fourth point is that the approach is integrated. The 3 lenses all map back onto the same underlying model and theory. This makes learning more coherent than piecing together non-integrated personality and role questionnaires. And my final point is that it is based on a rich underlying theory, which means that you can start a journey very easily, but this does not limit the longer journey into the depths of the human condition. We can start simply, but progress through much deeper levels as and when appropriate. To find out more about type mapping, you can watch other videos that focus on different aspects, such as using the TDI if your primary interest is personality. or Type Mapping and Introduction if you want a broader understanding of the approach. And if you want to use these questionnaires, you are welcome to get in touch. Thank you for listening.